I'm going to walk you through all of the pieces of my Lady Aragorn cosplay, the costume details, and how I made them. While I did genderbend this, I did not change the costume details from the original except where necessary due to female anatomy. I put a nerdy amount of research and effort into trying to make sure all of the details are correct. This whole project started out watching Lord of the Rings. I spotted Aragorn's cuffs and said, I can make that. Little did I know it was the start of a full-on cosplay and prop replica obsession. I've been slowly working on this cosplay for about 5 years, and I still plan on adding more pieces in the future. I don't have many photos from the beginning of this project, but my documentation became more thorough the further I got into it. The first thing I made was the cuffs. The cuffs are actually Boromir's. Aragorn takes them when he dies and wears them from then on. He can even be seen wearing them in his death. It's a lovely symbol of his promise to Boromir. I believe technically these are vambraces, however, a lot of people use the term bracer and vambrace interchangeably when referring to his cuffs. The vambraces are worn on both arms and consist of an inner quilted leather cuff which is laced up and an outer 2-layer cuff which is secured with 2 buckles. The outer layer is tooled leather decorated with symbols of Gondor, including the white tree. I actually made the inner cuffs twice. The inner cuffs were made of quilt batting sandwiched between 2 layers of thin leather. I used the ugliest leather in the universe on the inside and you wouldn't even know. I sewed the quilting pattern using a regular sewing machine. My machine hated me, but I got it done in the end. Then I used a thin strip of the same leather to create a bound edge. I machine stitched over top to secure it. I added 6 black eyelets on either side for the laces. Initially, I tied my cuffs up using leather lace, but this took forever and it wasn't too comfortable, plus there was long strips left at the end. I replaced the lace with black elastic. You can't tell the difference unless you look really close, and I can now put them on in 5 seconds instead of 5 minutes. For the outer cuffs, I started out with 6-ounce veg tan cowhide and tooled the design into the leather using bevel stamps. I used a thinner veg tan for the backing part as well as for the straps, which I wouldn't recommend. I should have used the same leather for both. I hand-stitched the front panel to the backing panel as well as stitched the straps on. Then I dyed the whole thing a dark brown and covered it with leather finish. I colored the trees silver using Sharpie and weathered them heavily to create an aged look. The only part of these that I still want to upgrade is the buckles. I do not know what strength is in my blood, but I swear to you I will one day weather these into oblivion so it looks like they've been worn in the wilderness for months. The next thing I made was the glove. Aragorn wears a fingerless leather glove on his right hand only. I'm assuming because he holds a sword with that hand. I used a bunch of black leather scraps to piece it together using my own pattern. I attempted to copy the layout of the scraps but was limited by access to good reference material. It's the only time I've ever made a glove, and they're poorly made but have an appropriately ragged look. Next I made the boots. The boots are gray leather pieced together with patchwork and laced up the inner leg. They have large fold-down cuffs at the top, which are wrapped with leather braids. I bought a pair of gray boots at the thrift store, cut a bunch of pieces off, and modified the shape. Basically, I just wanted proper soles as a base. While wearing the boots, I wrapped my legs in saran wrap and drew the seams on with Sharpie. Then I cut the pieces out and used them to create a paper pattern. I added seam allowance and selected the leather pieces. I used a thin gray suede. I pinned the leather pieces together with clips and sewed them using a sewing machine. A day may come when I don't obsess over cosplay details, but it is not this day. I spent an absurd amount of time hand-stitching over top of the seams so they looked like they could have been sewn by Aragorn himself. Once the boot covers were complete, I glued them directly to the boots using barge cement. I then trimmed the bottom edge so it lined up perfectly with the soles. The boots lace up along the middle using leather ties. I added a strip of thicker leather inside the boots to reinforce the holes. The boots take a long time to do up. The top flap folds over and is secured using round braided leather ties. It's a 4-strand round braid, the same method used for the ties on his jerkin. I braided these myself using the same leather as the boots. I weathered the boots by running through a bunch of mud during a photo shoot, but I'd like to dirty them up even more. Next, I made 4 fellowship cloaks for me and my nerd friends. I know the original cloaks are gray, but due to color correction, they appear to be green in most scenes, so we selected fabric that was actually green. I used the pattern from Alley Cat Scratch with small adjustments. Finding accurate-looking woolen fabric in that color proved really difficult. So in the end, we ended up choosing a gray-green fleece. It's inaccurate on close inspection, but has an appropriately fuzzy look when viewed from a distance. I don't have any photos of the making process. The cloaks go to about mid-calf on most of the characters, so I cut the length of the cloaks to match each of our heights. The cloak secure with clasps and the leaf brooch clips over top. Not idly did the leaves of Lorien fall, so I purchased our leaf brooches on Etsy. I didn't bother making pants as they are barely seen. I usually just wear black leggings. Next up, I made the red shirt. He begins wearing it in the Two Towers after arriving at Edoras and continues to wear it until after his arrival at Minas Tirith in Return of the King. Using a yoked shirt that I already had, I created my own pattern. After much fiddling and a couple of mock-ups, I was ready to jump in, but I delayed for over a year while searching for the perfect herringbone linen. In the end, I used a tablecloth I found at the thrift store for $4. The shirt is baggy and long, and there are slits on either side at the bottom. It has a yoke and what I think can be referred to as a keyhole neckline. Fashion terms are not my area, sorry. The sleeves are long and come down to partially cover the hands with a long slit at the cuff. This was the first time I'd ever sewn anything with sleeves, but it turned out okay. After completing the sewing, I added the leather detail at the neckline. I used flat leather lacing in black. I soaked the lacing in water and carefully folded it up with tiny accordion folds. Then I hand-stitched it down. After drying, the lace held its shape nicely, and I'm quite happy with the look. The shirt ties up partly down the v-neck with one set of braided leather ties. I added a bit of weathering using dye, tea, and paint, but I'd like to fade it a bit and weather it even more before I'll consider it done. Next up, I made the jerkin. I was quite intimidated to start on the jerkin as it was really pushing my sewing skills. The jerkin is a leather vest of brown suede which laces up the sides and front. It falls to knee-ish level, although the front is shorter than the back. There is a seam center back and the front has a hand-stitched patch on either side. I used a waistcoat pattern that I already owned, basically just as a basis for the breast and armholes. The rest of the pattern I created from scratch. My lady bosoms are much larger than Vigo's, so I needed darts at the front. I made a fabric mock-up and fiddled with that a lot, but fabric and leather are a very different beast. There was a lot of adjusting that happened during the construction process. I purchased a hide of brown suede about 5 ounces thick. I cut out my pattern pieces before sewing everything together at the shoulders. I used a regular sewing machine for this. I did skive the edges to make it thinner, but I'm really proud of my machine for holding up through this mistreatment. I folded all the seams back and stitched them down. At that point, I tried the vest on with a belt and did some trimming at the side seams and at the front for a proper fit. The bottom hem is very worn and shredded, so I went ahead and did that before stitching and edge binding. I have some skill with a blade, so I used a dull skiver and hacked away. Next, I found 2 pieces of brown leather scraps for the front patches. Luckily, these hide the darts at the front. I wish I skived down the seams more before sewing them on, but they aren't as visible with the belt on. I glued the patches on using barge cement and then hand-stitched them in a purposefully messy fashion. Next, I moved on to the edge binding. The leather I was using was too thick for this purpose. I ended up buying thin pigskin suede in the same color and cutting my own strips. I added the binding to all of the edges of the vest with the exception of the bottom. This was a long ordeal as I had to piece my short strips together, but I'm really pleased with how it turned out. I used a small square of leather at the top of the back slit for reinforcement. This is visible on the original. I punched holes along the sides and laced them up using round leather lace. Then I moved on to the ties. The front laces up with 5 sets of round leather braids. I used the same pigskin suede and braided them myself. This alone took me an entire day. The braids are secured with a strange method. Big shout out to M. Sheridan Arts on Instagram for showing me how to do this. I used tape to figure out the placement of the ties. Added some leather rectangles to the inside to give some extra support to the holes. 3 holes are punched and the braids are wound around in such a way that they secure themselves. At this point, the jerkin was done, but I added a lot of weathering. The bottom was discolored where I'd skived it, so I used dye to dirty it up. I used oil, acrylic paint, dust, accidentally some blood, and some random other things to dirty it up, but I plan on adding a lot more weathering over time. I purchased my belt buckle from Hammerhand Workshop and it's perfect. The pattern for the belt is difficult to discern as you never really get a clear look at it. It appears to be a diamond shape with perhaps a circle inside. Every replicator has gone a different direction with this. I played around with options and I settled on this because a circle within a diamond looks like an eye to me, and I thought stars were a more appropriate symbol choice for the King of Gondor. I cut a long strip out of veg tan cowhide, beveled the edges, and transferred the pattern. Then I tooled the design in. While it was still wet, I beat it up with random objects to add to the aged look. The leatherworker on Lord of the Rings actually hammers leather against a big rock to create a worn look. I dyed the belt dark brown and covered it with leather finish. The belt buckle was then sewn on. The belt is secured by tying it around itself. I actually made my belt way too short. The original hangs down quite a ways. On the belt are a rock used as a sword sharpener and a small pouch which I'm guessing is for tobacco. I sewed the pouch out of some scrap that I had. It ties up and there's a loop on the back side for the belt. belt. I went down to the river and found a nice oval rock. I wet formed the little holder for it and hand stitched it together. Then I dyed it brown. There's a loop on the backside and I just slide it onto the belt. Other items that I included in the cosplay are things I did not make. Metal is not in my skill set, so I purchased the rest of these items online. Aragorn wears the Ring of Bear here on his left index finger. I also purchased the Even Star necklace given to him by Arwen, although I performed some jewelry surgery on it because the clasp was not correct and it was too long. The cosplay is still a work in progress. The dagger is mostly finished. I actually made it out of polymer clay. I know, I'm insane, and I would not recommend it, but it sort of worked. I drew the writing on using Sharpie. A day may come when I feel confident making the duster, but it is not this day. It's on my maybe someday list. I also plan on making the quiver at some point as well. And that's it. I didn't really find any videos on here that went into too much detail about all of the parts of Aragorn's costume, so it felt like it needed to be done. Find me on Instagram at snappingdragonleather and tag me in your Aragorn cosplays because I love seeing them. Let's hunt some orc.